Am I about to find out you were too young to have the old wheel-in TV trays in school?
Yes.
Dear, oh dear. I'm logging off right now.
And we're back from the break. Thank you guys. Thank you for the hate. You know what? My only reference for wheeling in TVs is like media references to wheeling in TVs, such that I'm familiar with the notion of wheeling in a TV, but has always been framed as something, I don't want to say this word, but I want to say it ancient. It feels
Okay, well, just say it then. Just bloody say it. Fine. Ancient. How
Back in
dare
the
you?
Neolithic, TVs were all just wheeled in.
This is going massively off topic, but I think I was in school at that moment when the transition happened from like the old wheeling in the old TV tray to put on a VHS tape to when schools started spending what must have been hundreds of thousands of pounds each to bring in these like fancy whiteboards where you could like write on it in a
Or
digital
the digital
pen.
whiteboard. And
And
nobody
they
knew
never
how to
ever
use
worked.
them.
They never ever worked. And it was
Constant
like
panic.
digital whiteboards.
yeah,
People
so
would
it was
put,
like
YouTube on it.
don't tell me you didn't have digital whiteboards either. Jesus, this is going to be like the
I mean,
end
I
of
had
News
like
Club.
actual whiteboards.
You just had holograms.
Okay, so this was like, I'm sure, you know, I don't know the story behind it. I'm sure there's some like Blair era PFI corruption behind it. But basically at one point, every school was like, these digital whiteboards are the cutting edge of technology. We've got to replace our normal whiteboards where you just have a whiteboard and a pen and a wipe with this like touch screen, an early touch screen where like you had a sort of a fake marker pen and the screen would detect where you were writing and then it would be like on the computer and you could move things. And they just never ever worked. I don't actually know how they worked because the ones I had in school never worked.
We had a projector that projected onto a whiteboard.
Yeah.
That was just a computer screen. So it was exactly the same as having just actually had a projector.
Just about to say, yeah, you've described like the classic whiteboard that was at the front of like the room that we had, and then they had to like, you know, we'd call it the game where you'd like see people like your teacher would recalibrate it and like have to draw the lines to the middle. But what you've just described suggests that we like people had individual ones.
No. This was still the one at the front of the class.
Oh, okay,
No.
okay, cool.
That's to come next. That'll be the big Starmer reform to education. Is an iPad tablet for every child, sponsored by Apple.
Tablet, yeah.
AI tablets, yeah.
Right, so we're gonna swiftly move on from wheeling in TVs to wheeling in bins and why they're actually not being wheeled in.
Very good.
Yes, I told you there'd be a pun. I told you guys.
Oh, that was really clever.
That was very, very clever. So yes, this is the Birmingham bin strike, which has been going on since January. The actual dispute between the waste collectors in Birmingham and the local council has been going back to January. But since the middle of March, a lot of the waste collectors have been out on permanent, indefinite strike while negotiations are ongoing. Basically, what's happened is Birmingham Council declared bankruptcy back in 2023. This is off the back of obviously a decade and more of national government cuts to local government. So council everywhere are having less money to do more and more services. They've been raising local council tax levels, but it's nowhere near enough to substitute the money that's been taken away by national government. Waste collectors in Birmingham had already accepted a £1,000 voluntary pay cut as their sort of attempt to help the council to balance its budgets. But the council now
Voluntary.
They voluntarily accepted to take pay cuts because they recognise their jobs are so essential and it's a workforce that needs to happen. And unbelievably, they've taken this heroic step to voluntarily accept a first stage of cuts. But of course, with greedy councils, they always come back for more. So they are now trying to cut their pay by £6,000 a year, which in any walk of, if you were an investment banker, you would not accept a £6,000 pay cut, let alone if you are a sort of median income bin collector in Birmingham doing an unglamorous but completely essential public service job. So I wanted to talk, I mean, obviously the strike itself is really important to support, but I think what's interesting is how the media coverage has focused almost exclusively on pictures of waste piling up on people's streets, the public health hazards from the kind of massive sort of swarm of rats that are building up around the waste piles, the risk for public health around diseases. There's lots of footage of long queues of people queuing up to take their bins to the tip themselves in place of the weekly bin collections that aren't happening due to the strike. And in some cases, there are some quite positive stories about people in the communities coming together, helping each other out, like people taking a day on the weekend to go and help vulnerable people clear the waste off their streets and kind of, you know, people sharing cars to take lots of waste to the tips all in one go. But of course, what's completely missing from the media coverage is the perspective of the refuse workers themselves, the reasons why they're on strike and the devastating impact that the council's proposed direct cuts to their pay would actually have on their lives, and actually what the cuts would have even on the future functioning of the bin service itself, like who is going to work in refuse collection if you've just seen already that their pay has been reduced by £6,000 a year? What does that tell you about the kind of conditions and respect that are given by the council to people working in this service? And I think also we've seen a lot of like really standard, and this is a Labour council in Birmingham, and they've been employing really what can only be described as like strike breaking tactics borrowed from the Thatcher era. They've been calling in the police to corral the picket lines, basically on spurious claims which we always see of like the council saying we needed to call in the police because the strikers were blocking the roads or intimidating people who had gone into work. And like none of this has ever been evidence, but it's really helped to support this idea of like strikers aren't people out for good conditions and pay. Strikers are militant yobbos who have just come in to like make a fuss and demand money for nothing. The council have also brought in really expensive agency workers, partly as scabs, but also partly as just like a way to undermine the collective bargaining position of the refuse collectors themselves in the longer term, which is unbelievable because the amount of money they're now spending on the agency workers, I imagine, is much more than it would have cost them to just settle the dispute at the current pay levels. And in a lot of the council's public communication on the strikes, they've kept repeating this lie that's so often repeated across lots of strikes in public sector work, a kind of core strike-breaking tactic, which is to say striking workers should simply give up, go back to work and pull all this nonsense to rest. And the local and national media is very happily parroted these lines from the council without a whiff of basic kind of critical analysis. Like we were talking about before, there's not been a sense of any media coverage stepping back and saying, why is this strike continuing? Why are these workers doing this? What is the sort of long-term impact for the functioning of waste collection in Birmingham? What does it tell us about the state of council finances and the basic relationship between paying for services and the people who do them?
Yeah, can you speak a little bit more about collective bargaining?
It's the essential notion behind trade unions is if you want to try and secure your work and argue for a better wage, power is in numbers. And you come together and you say, well, all of us who work in this particular business or all of us who work in this particular public service will refuse to work or reduce the work we're doing unless all of us together have some kind of pay or conditions that we can all agree on. And it's very difficult for an employer, or it used to be very difficult for an employer to find ways around that because their entire workforce was deciding, well, unless I get the pay and conditions I want, I'm not going back to work. And this is where the strike-breaking tactics come in to undermine collective bargaining, is by bringing in agency workers, by having this media blitzkrieg around saying that strikers aren't people with jobs. Strikers are people trying to create a nuisance, trying to ruin people's lives, willingly letting waste build up in the streets because they're yobbos and nuisances, etc., etc. That's the essence of collective bargaining, which has been undermined since the 70s in the ways that lots of public services now are increasingly reliant on agency workers. They will suddenly find money to pay agency workers when they can't find money to pay their actual staff.
I also keep thinking about good work strikes and the fact that I can't see how that translates with this particular line of work. Is there a way around of people doing the work and also simultaneously like imposing a challenge?
And there have been examples of, for example, people on railways being like, well, we're just not going to enforce non-payment. And that's been that's been a really effective strategy in other parts of the world. The problem in the UK is that we have such restrictive laws around what trade unions can and can't do, and when they are protected by being on strike. So there's all of these legal frameworks, and if you follow all of the rules, then you can go on strike and you basically can't be sacked for doing that, even though of course they can like dock your pay. Whereas if you step outside of the rules, then they can start saying, well, now you're not performing your job, and then the union itself can start to be liable for the costs to the company or to the local council or whatever. And these rules that trade unions have to follow have got like more and more restrictive since the 1980s, and they're now like insane. It is so difficult to go on strike, and this is like why it's actually been remarkable in the last few years that we have seen this real wave of strike action, because you have to not only get, when you're putting a ballot out and saying, do you want to go on strike, you not only have to get a majority of people to say yes, but you have to get a certain turnout in terms of your registered members. And there's all of these like it's like super boring to describe. And what it also means is that trade unions become incredibly boring places. Like the opportunity to actually talk about, so for example, with the strikes with the university and college union, so this is what academics are usually part of, you would go into a UCU meeting, and the time that it would take to just describe what had happened and all the steps that the union was taking at the national level or what your local branch was doing, whatever. It would take up the whole meeting. You would never actually get to talk about any of the substantial issues, like how changes were affecting your work or how you were dealing with management or whatever. So it's a kind of death by bureaucracy process where it's like exactly what you say, like these more creative strategies of like, well, what if we still run the trains, but we just don't make people pay for them, which means that people can still get to work, they still get the service that they want, but what we're actually harming is the bosses. That's a great tactic. And that's the sort of thing where if you were in a union meeting and someone was proposing that, you could have a really exciting conversation about it. But you absolutely cannot do that as a registered union. And so instead what you have to have is like loads of conversations about like the precise procedures that you've gone through and like the precise timing of the ballots and has it been sent out to exactly the right people and what's the threshold for whatever. And it just becomes the most dead, boring conversation. And of course that massively puts people off being part of unions.
So what do we do? Like, what is one of the responses we can have to like this failing over bureaucratized institution?
I mean, there definitely are these kind of newer unions that have set up in the last sort of 10 years. So things like the Independent Workers of Great Britain and UVW, which is United Voices of the World. There's a bunch of others, and they're trying to think in a much more creative way about how to organize people, particularly in sectors where the IWGB is literally for people who their work contract will be as an individual. So if you're working for Deliveroo, you're not part of an official workforce. You're just officially like a freelancer. So how do you even bring those people together or get them to like see themselves as a group? And so it's very, very difficult to organize in those spaces in some ways, but in other ways, these are the spaces that like Unison is not interested in, Unite is not interested in. Like the big established unions are often like we're not even going to try and bring those workers together. So they are not kind of restricted in the same way by like these bureaucracies. It's both stuff that the state has imposed and it's also the cultures within these unions and the union workers. So newer unions, I think, are thinking in different ways. And also because they are often trying to organize in the most precarious parts of the economy, which have a lot of migrant workers, they're also taking strategies and tactics from other parts of the world. And particularly, there's a lot of Latinx people in those unions. And there's a really different and much more, I don't know, like they're both much more up for a fight in terms of like up for pushing the boundaries of what they can do. But I think there's also an understanding that like to make a union a space where people are actually feeling like this isn't just about boring meetings and maybe a 3% rise in my pay. This is actually about us trying to build a movement. So then they'll run like socials, they'll have big barbecues, people will bring their whole families. And this I understand as being very much like a cultural thing, largely drawn from Latin America, of like how do you make the union basically feel more like church and then feel like something that people will actually like show up for, want to be part of, actually maybe even feel like a little bit of joy around, rather than it just being a like, here's a letter that I got in the post and here's like an extremely boring meeting that I'm gonna like have on in the background while I'm cooking dinner.
I love the idea of unions bringing like carne asadas into the country. That's amazing. Let's do that. Let's do more of that. You ever had that, Chivers? You ever done that? You ever been invited? You ever had
No
the
one
honor?
invites me anywhere. I mean, even on the best of times, no one invites me to anything. I think Debs was talking there about like positive unions, and what's been also really interesting to see is the rise of other union movements which aren't necessarily collected to work, but like Acorn as a union which is connected to sort of protecting people as citizens in basic sort of vulnerable conditions, like people in the community coming together to prevent no-fault evictions or stopping bailiffs from, tearing apart people's homes on the basis of bills, which, all of these weird legal traps and ways that people are punished. So, there's what Debs was describing is, I think, definitely a community activist shift away from the more traditional kind of monolithic union approach, because I think it's not necessarily the big unions have become very bureaucratic, but that's also a reflection of what's happened to the notion of work in general, that it's not something that's a part of your life and you build communities around it and you sort of, it's so essential to the conditions of safe, healthy, prosperous living that unions are there to ensure that. It's more that work is something that you have to do to earn a living. And unless there's something going wrong with that living, unions kind of take a backseat and wait till the big disputes. Whereas the more community-focused unions recognize that, yeah, exactly those sorts of social relationships, building communities through collective action and sharing in different struggles, whether it's to do with work or whether it's to do with someone in your local community being under threat from an eviction or from bailiffs or from harmful actions of local governments, I think is, yeah, a really inspiring thing that's happened in the midst of everything else going on that seems really bad. So definitely something to do is like get involved in unions like Acorn, consider setting up your own community union in your area and think of like, you know, even beyond labour disputes, what is going on in our community where we could bring people together and make a force to do something about it.
Fuck yeah. Would you do that, Snake Grape? She's muted. She's unmuted.
Apologies. Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking, there's so many useful actions and suggestions within what both of you have spoken about there. I think a really big part of it is just kind of, yeah, building more of these sort of smaller community solidarity things. It feels like we are at a tipping point, right? Like, I saw a video earlier today where someone was saying like, how are we still having people being like homophobic in the apocalypse? We're not. You're told for a very, very long time that you're scaremongering when you talk about things like pre-Brexit, when you talk about things like Trump. And a lot of things are just happening now in a very, very real and scary way. And it's no longer a case of like spending your time trying to convince people to do the right thing. It's time to like get in community and support the people around you. And I think looking at things like, yeah, fuck it, don't pay your water bill. Don't pay your water bill, because by not doing it, you're providing a buffer to all of the other people who aren't doing it and who probably can't afford to pay their water bills right now. When it comes to supporting strikers, when it comes to supporting protesters, like just using what you do have, which is like your wallet, your attention span, and your body to provide a buffer and support people in whatever way you can, I think is super important. Yeah, I feel like from the bins all the way to everything else that's happening in the world at the minute, it feels like that purpose of building like community groups and community action is going to be the only thing that gets us through on a practical level, but also like emotionally keeps us remotely, I'm not going to say like sane, but like at the level we're at and not worse. But yeah, it's so I think it's really cool to hear you guys kind of talking through how we can go about that in more solid ways.
So basically, My Little Pony got it right, and friendship is magic, guys. That's it. That's it.
That little pony never misses.
But yeah, speak to your mates. Don't pay your water bill. Go to the carne asada with your union friends and
invite me when you hold them. I need to go to stuff.
and invite Chivers.
I don't know. We'll hear what you've got to say about the TV license first.
I think that's partly why I'm not invited to parties anymore, because my talking pieces are like BBC reform, media legislation. Have you heard what Ofcom did recently? And people are like, he's not fucking coming again. Don't invite that guy to the next cookout, you know.
But going back to what Deb said, this is why we have to ask people, you know what I mean, and have consenting spaces where we're like, you know what, guys, today we're going to delve into this.
Next week, whether you like it or not, TV license fee discourse.
Shit, let's do it. But yeah, thank you so much, guys. I've actually really enjoyed this. I love listening to you guys. And thank you to our audience, whoever's listening, for also listening. Crazy. And make sure to follow us on News Club. We have a newsletter coming out every week. And we have this podcast coming out every week with these brilliant, brilliant people that we can learn so much from. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks all.
Thank you.